Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today it's time for the first monitor review of 2021 with a look at the Alienware AW2721D. I know this has been a hotly requested monitor review from many of you, and thanks to the fine folks at Dell, we're able to check it out today. This is also the first monitor review on the channel using our new test methodology that's been updated for 2021. So if you missed our previous video detailing all of that, it's well worth a watch. The AW2721D is a new high-end 27-inch 1440p monitor, giving us our first look at the combination of a 240Hz refresh rate and IPS technology at this resolution. Alienware touting a true 1 millisecond grey-to-grey response time here. We'll see about that, but we do know the monitor uses a latest generation LG IPS panel, so we're expecting performance that's similar to other LG IPS products. Another important point on the spec sheet is that of G-Sync Ultimate support, although it's the new watered down G-Sync Ultimate, not the high standard the program once commanded. G-Sync Ultimate used to be for the best HDR displays on the market, but that's not the case in 2021, as the AW2721D has somehow qualified despite having just Display HDR 600 certification and only edge-lit local dimming. It is HDR compatible and features 98% DCI-P3 coverage, so we'll see how it performs a bit later. With its 1440p 240Hz capabilities, this new Alienware display is competing directly with the Samsung Odyssey G7, another 1440p 240Hz display we looked at last year with a curved VA panel instead. The AW2721D offers something a bit different, and it's also more expensive, currently commanding an $825 price directly through the Dell website. The good news though is that it is actually available, which we can't say about every new bit of hardware we test these days. The AW2721D is quite a large monitor for something that only has a 27-inch panel, and I'm not talking about the bezels here, but rather the overall monitor body. The stand is very beefy and it attaches to a rather thick display housing. The whole thing is much heavier than I expected, although this allows it to be very sturdy. And while the majority of the outer materials are plastic, I think it looks quite premium with its mixture of black and white soft finishes. I'm not a fan of the large 27 printed onto the rear, but outside of that, it's a pretty clean body with some nice curves. RGB lighting is found here integrated into a light bar on the back of the stand, as well as the classic alien head logo. This isn't a huge selling point for me, but it is something that other people find important. Tucked neatly behind the magnetic port cover are a display port and 2 HDMI ports, plus some USB ports. You'll need to use DisplayPort to access the maximum 240Hz refresh rate, as HDMI is limited to just 144Hz at this resolution, and this display does not support HDMI 2.1. Alienware are offering the full complement of adjustability here, including height, tilt, swivel, and pivot capabilities, so you could operate this monitor in a portrait orientation if you wanted to. The level of height adjustment is also quite generous, and I think it's helped by having such a huge stand assembly, even though the stand legs don't take up a ton of desk space. The on-screen display is controllable through a directional toggle placed behind the monitor's bottom right corner, and in there you'll find a modest set of features. The color controls are a little lacking, however for gamers you do get refresh rate and timer options, though no cheat crosshairs. There's also no backlight strobing available, as the LG IPS panel here has a slow red phosphor which interferes with strobing as we've seen previously. Alienware only offer 3 response time settings here, however the monitor does use a native G-Sync module, so variable overdrive is a feature and thus we shouldn't have to change settings very often, so let's see how it performs. At 240Hz using the lowest overdrive mode, fast, it's clear that overdrive is indeed enabled. The reason I make this rather obvious point is that as the fast mode is the lowest mode, you actually can't disable overdrive on this display entirely. I'm not sure how many people actually would want to do that, but as you can see there is some overshoot present on the lowest mode, and without a lower setting this is the least amount of overshoot you'll see. Is this level of overshoot problematic? Not at all. The majority of transitions are not affected by any sort of noticeable overshoot, and instead we are left with a 4.47 millisecond grey-to-grey average response time, which is excellent. Using our newer test methodology, which is gamma corrected and measures more of the response time curve, we do spot some slower transitions, particularly fall times that have a longer trail. However, based on the displays I've tested so far, this is somewhat common for IPS panels, and this is far from the worst example. On the right you'll see our new cumulative deviation results, which measure how close the response behavior gets to the ideal instant response. Given many of you won't have seen this metric before, I'll provide some context in that scoring 414 points here is excellent and indicates a fast panel. An average result is around 600. We also get 70% refresh rate compliance, which when using our new methodology is sufficient to call this a true 240Hz display, which is a great sign from an IPS panel. The overdrive settings above fast are not worth using. Super fast does decrease response times to 3.57 milliseconds on average, but this comes with a significant increase to overshoot. As a result, our cumulative deviation numbers increase, suggesting we are further from an ideal response than in the previous mode. The extreme mode is even worse, and to me this looks like a setting included purely to market the monitor as being 1 millisecond. You can see the best transitions are in the 1 millisecond range. I'd have much rather Alienware include a mode below fast with less overshoot than bother with this extreme mode that looks a lot worse. In terms of performance across the refresh range, buyers of the AW2721D should stick with using the fast mode here, which provides a single overdrive mode experience, exactly what I'd expect from a premium display. At times, overshoot can be a little higher than I'd like, particularly at 200 Hz, but for the most part, the level of overshoot is manageable and not that noticeable in practice. You can see variable overdrive at play here, especially below 100 Hz, where the monitor appears to switch to a slower mode to keep overshoot in check. This is fine for lower refresh rate gaming, and I'm glad it's implemented this way to prevent users from having to change overdrive settings depending on the refresh rate they are gaming at. Comparing the AW2721D to other gaming monitors, the response time numbers here are generally very solid when looking at peak performance recorded at the display's maximum refresh rate. An average result below 5 milliseconds is elite, putting this display among the fastest that I've tested. The overshoot numbers here are not amazing compared to the Omen X27 for example, however performance is a step above 144 and 165Hz displays of the past like the LG 27G850. Average performance across the refresh range is also very solid, and interestingly, performance is very similar between the AW2721D and Dell S2721DGF, both of which use LG IPS panels. Previous Nano IPS panels already had the response times to handle a 240Hz refresh rate, they just needed that sort of refresh rate to be unlocked, and it seems like that's basically what we are getting here. When viewing cumulative deviation, showing how close the monitor gets to the ideal response, the AW2721D sits among a huge glut of modern IPS monitors that all deliver a similar experience in that 500 to 600 point range when measured across their refresh range. This Alienware monitor does benefit from an increased refresh range, and does so without negatively affecting its overall performance. However, fundamentally this new 1440p 240Hz IPS panel from LG does not push IPS ahead in terms of response behavior compared to what was already on the market. That's not a bad thing at all, but those wanting an AW2721D specifically for better performance, even at lower refreshes like 144 Hz, aren't really getting that here. Again, the main benefit is simply a higher refresh rate overall. And you'll see what I'm talking about here when looking at response times recorded at 120 Hz. The AW2721D does deliver great performance in that 5 millisecond range, but it's not fundamentally different to other offerings, so buyers of this display should be primarily interested in gaming above 165 Hz either now or in the future. Meanwhile, due to the way variable overdrive operates on this monitor, the AW2721D is only a mid-range performer at 60 Hz. You're actually better off here with an LG 27G850 for gaming in that lower refresh range, although if you wanted faster response times and were okay with much higher overshoot, then you could increase the overdrive mode one notch. Input latency is excellent at 240 Hz with practically no processing delay on the monitor's side, leaving the only remaining latency due to refresh lag and response lag. I know some people will be very interested to see how the Alienware monitor fares up against the Samsung Odyssey G7, and unfortunately we haven't tested the G7 using our new methodology, so here's a look back at our legacy test suite to compare these displays. In terms of the best performance at 240 Hz, the AW2721D isn't quite as good as the Odyssey, mostly due to higher overshoot at similar response time averages, but these displays do trade blows and the Alienware monitor isn't that far behind. On average across the refresh range, the G7 does have a clearer edge, ending up with less overshoot and also a 10% faster response time on average. Samsung's latest VA technology with no dark level smearing is extremely impressive and actually holds up a bit better for these premium, high refresh rate displays than IPS. Nothing unusual to see here from the power consumption side of things. The AW2721D is slightly more efficient than the HP Omen X27's TN display, even factoring in RGB lighting. Moving now into color performance, and the AW2721D is a wide gamut display featuring 96% coverage of the P3 color space, so that's great for creators that want to leverage this display for their wide gamut work. However, a big negative here is this Alienware display does not have an sRGB mode at all, so there is no way to emulate or clamp this gamut down to sRGB for viewing regular content. This will leave viewers with an oversaturated experience in many instances, especially when, for example, watching YouTube videos, something that does not play nicely with ICC profiles. So this is a huge oversight from a premium monitor. On a positive note, the AW2721D does feature excellent factory grayscale calibration. My unit had near perfect adherence to the sRGB gamma curve and a negligible deviation from the accurate CCT curve. This led to low delta E's from the factory and virtually no appreciable tint to the monitor. One thing that G-Sync Ultimate monitors tend to succeed at is factory grayscale calibration, and that's no exception with this display. Unfortunately, when viewing sRGB content, there is going to be some level of oversaturation, as like I mentioned before, there is no sRGB mode. All things considered, this isn't the worst result I've seen from a wide gamut display, and some people actually like this look, but it could be better. Similar results in color checker, the positive here being that skin tones aren't affected significantly, so it's unlikely you'll see a sunburned look, however oversaturation is still present. As grayscale performance is great from the factory and there's no sRGB mode, there is little that can be done in the OSD to improve performance, aside from a few minor grayscale tweaks if things are slightly off. So the next step is a full calibration, and as expected, I achieved excellent results. A grayscale delta EITP below 2.0 and strong performance in other color metrics when measuring against sRGB. No surprise, as there is 100% coverage of this color space. For P3 work, we also see generally strong results, although as coverage is only 96% instead of 100%, you will lose a small amount of accuracy at the top end of the saturation range. But this isn't significant enough to affect overall performance, and overall I'd say that with calibration, the AW2721D is a great monitor for P3. When comparing factory grayscale calibration to other monitors I've tested, the Alienware AW2721D is one of the best, topping the charts as I like to see from premium displays. Color checker factory calibration is also not the worst, although sRGB only monitors like the BenQ EX2510 do deliver a noticeably better experience. Maximum brightness is outstanding in the SDR mode, pushing 532 nits, which is more than sufficient for indoor usage in pretty much all environments. Despite such high peak brightness, the AW2721D also delivers great minimum brightness at a touch below 50 nits, so there is a large range of values here to tweak brightness to your liking. With LG IPS panels, there is always some discussion on contrast ratio, especially since the early days of monitors like the 27G850. However, since that initial release of nano IPS displays, LG has been able to improve the contrast ratio with newer panels. While the AW2721D doesn't have a fantastic contrast ratio, it's easily beaten by VA panels, I recorded roughly a 1000:1 result, which is on par for a modern IPS monitor. Viewing angles are outstanding, and LG panels remain some of the best on the market in this area. There is very little color shift when viewing at off angles, which gives you the flexibility to view this display in different ways. As for uniformity, I was also generally pleased with the results, although there was some fall off along the outer edges. The central zone was great, but my unit did exhibit some IPS glow in the bottom right corners, although your mileage may vary, and I suspect this will improve on my sample over time. Wrapping up our performance testing is a look at HDR. The AW2721D, despite being G-Sync Ultimate, is only a semi-HDR panel. Of the three pillars of HDR, what this monitor lacks is proper local dimming. We're only getting 32 edge-lit zones here, which is insufficient for producing bright highlights and deep blacks on screen at the same time, a cornerstone of an HDR presentation. In practice, there is significant haloing extending from the edges of the monitor to any bright objects, and this can be distracting and worse than no local dimming at all, depending on the content. What the AW2721D gets right is brightness. Sustained brightness of around 520 nits with a full white window is decent, and that increases to 750 nits for bright flashes, enough to dazzle in indoor conditions. The display can also sustain over 700 nits for lower window sizes, adding to a decent but not chart-topping collection of brightness numbers. In a best case scenario, the AW2721D can change from bright to dark in separate frames to good effect, delivering a dynamic contrast ratio as high as 63,000:1. However, when measuring within a single frame, the AW2721D in even the best case scenario fails to reach a baseline target contrast ratio of 50,000:1 for an OK HDR experience. This is with a bright and dark object far away on the screen. And in our worst case single frame contrast test, which measures a bright and dark object side by side, the AW2721D does not deliver an HDR experience at all. This is because edge-lit local dimming cannot sufficiently dim the screen for HDR content, so within each column zone you fall back to the display's native contrast ratio. If a panel cannot improve upon its SDR numbers in this test, it's not delivering a true HDR experience. In terms of HDR accuracy, this display is also a mixed bag. The monitor doesn't handle brightness roll-off well, so elements that should be bright are not as bright as they should be. For some reason, RGB balance also gets a lot colder at higher brightness levels, while it's decent and quite accurate at lower brightness levels. However, in the HDR mode, the AW2721D doesn't do the worst job of keeping to proper saturation performance within the limits of what the display can do. Particularly when viewing P3 and Rec 709 sweeps inside BT 2020, the results were better than I expected, so saturation tends to be quite well held in this mode, and this should deliver a good color experience. Overall, the Alienware AW2721D is a pretty great high-end gaming monitor, and one that shows the promise of IPS technology for 1440p 240Hz applications. Thanks to advancements made in the last few years, IPS is definitely fast enough for these sorts of refresh rates, and while this particular monitor doesn't set any new performance records, it was consistently near the top of our response time charts, which is what buyers forking out over $800 on a new monitor will be after. I was also quite impressed with this display's versatility. With features like 96% P3 coverage, excellent factory grayscale calibration, and a nice flat panel with excellent viewing angles, the AW2721D is also suitable for creative and general office work. If you want a single monitor in your setup to tackle both high-end gaming and productivity work, then something like the AW2721D is going to set you up perfectly now and for many years into the future. After all, hitting 1440p at 240Hz in today's games is quite a challenge. There are several other little bonuses sprinkled in here as well. Variable overdrive keeps performance solid across the refresh range, leading to a coveted single overdrive mode experience, input lag is virtually zero, and the build quality was impressive and befitting of its price tag. While on the whole this is a great display and I'm very positive about the results, there are some oversights. Not having an sRGB emulation mode in such a high-end product is a huge omission, especially as this monitor is so well suited for general everyday work. The use of an LG IPS panel prevents us from getting backlight strobing for added motion clarity, and despite being a G-Sync Ultimate display, the HDR performance on offer here is poor as we're only getting edge-lit local dimming. You can see how it stacks up here in our performance summary chart, new for this review and something we might use going forward. A couple of weaknesses shown in red, but on the whole, a lot of green results indicating this monitor performs above average compared to all the other displays we've tested so far. As for whether you should buy the AW2721D, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering whether to get this or go for something like the Samsung Odyssey G7, so here's my simple breakdown as I have tested both at this point. If you're after just a pure gaming monitor, the Odyssey G7 is probably going to be the better option. It's cheaper, especially at 27 inches, and features better response time results. It also has the benefit of twice the contrast ratio and includes backlight strobing, which is a feature that many people desire for its motion clarity benefits. However, the Odyssey G7 is really only a gaming display. The AW2721D with its IPS panel is much more versatile, and I'd recommend it for those that also want to use their monitor for other things. The Alienware Options flat panel is much better at this size in my opinion, plus you're getting better viewing angles, better uniformity, a wider color gamut, and better factory calibration. All of these elements combined with response time numbers that aren't too far off the Odyssey, so overall it's a great balance of features. At this price there are a couple of other options as well, like going 4K 144Hz instead with a monitor like the LG 27GN950, but for today's gaming I'd probably swing more towards the AW2721D, especially as the 27GN950 lacks HDMI 2.1. High-end ultrawides may also come into consideration, although at that point we're basically talking about a different category of display for a different sort of buyer. Anyway, that's it for this monitor review of the AW2721D. If you did enjoy this review, you learned a lot, you got what you needed, then consider supporting Hardware Unboxed through our Patreon and Float Plan accounts. You'll get access to things like early access to our videos if you do sign up to our Float Plan account. There is also access to our ICC profiles. The calibrated profiles that we create for these reviews are available to all of our supporters. So yeah, check the links in the description below. You might get a few nice little bonuses there. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.